a big part of the government's agenda is to displace the illicit market.
2 years in jail for a landlord who leases to a dispensary that's not authorized, that's an insane response to what should just be a simple problem.
Hello, I'm Peter Van Dusen, and this is Primetime Politics on CPAC. The federal government is facing growing demands from municipalities and First Nations for money and control as the countdown to legalizing cannabis in Canada continues. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities says it wants 1/3 of all revenues from the excise taxes on marijuana to flow to cities to cover the costs of enforcement for local police forces and municipal departments. Federal and provincial finance ministers will meet this weekend in Ottawa, and marijuana revenues and how to divvy them up will be on the agenda. Meanwhile, First Nations leaders are demanding the right to pass their own laws for marijuana use and want the right to govern the sale and distribution of legal pot on their lands. The challenges keep coming on this file for the government's point man on pot. He's Bill Blair, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice, and he's with me now. It's good to see you again.
Good to be here.
Thanks for coming by to speak with me. You've said you'll split the revenues from excise taxes on the sale of cannabis products, 50-50 with the provinces. Now the cities are saying, wait a minute, they want this to be a three-way split. What do you say to them?
Well, first of all, cities have always been an important part of this discussion, and right from the outset. When I traveled across the country, I always made a point of going in to see the local mayor, the police chief, the fire chief, the person responsible for public health, the person responsible for bylaw enforcement. And we recognize the important role that the cities have to play when we put these regulatory frameworks in place. The federal government has responsibility for regulating the production. The province primarily for regulating its distribution, but that, of course, will take place in municipalities. And, of course, then there's also regulations and zoning and bylaw issues to be addressed within a municipality. And so we've included them in this discussion. And, you know, the way in which federal excise taxes may be distributed. It is a discussion that needs to take place between the federal finance minister, his provincial and territorial counterparts. But the needs and the responsibilities of municipalities has always been front of mind in that discussion.
Okay, so are you open to are you sympathetic to their demands that, look, as for all the things you just mentioned, we're the frontline people. We have to deal with this, and you're a former police chief, so you know what, there's extra demands on the local police force in terms of enforcement, different government departments that have to change laws and different things, and you know what's involved. And they're saying we need to be part of we need to get some of that revenue right to cities to be able to handle the extra costs of these changes.
And Peter, in response to that, like right away, we know that there's costs of setting this thing up, and so we've already made money available for the training and the resources for police officers. $81 million to be distributed through the provincial authorities to municipalities and Indigenous police services, so that they have access to the money that they're going to need to get their people trained as drug recognition experts in standardized field sobriety testing. You know, we're paying for a significant portion of those oral fluids testing kits that will be made available to law enforcement in the spring. You know, we know that infrastructure has to be put in place, and we've made money available for that infrastructure, for that enforcement, that oversight and testing. We've put money into Health Canada, a lot of money, about
so are you saying no to? They're saying it needs to be a three-way split. It sounds like you're saying we've already given them money to deal with.
What I'm saying is we've made upfront investments in recognition that there is an impact on municipalities. And, you know, I met just in the past week with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Finance Minister, and we had a very fulsome discussion about what their concerns and requirements are. And we want to make sure that in the discussion that's about to take place between our minister and his provincial and territorial counterparts, that the requirements of municipalities are known and addressed in that discussion. It's one of the reasons we went out 4 weeks ago with a discussion document and on the cannabis taxation framework. We asked for input. We sought the input of municipalities and organizations like FCM. We've also heard from, you know, medical marijuana advocates, from licensed producers, from a number of different, you know, important stakeholders in this issue, and asked for their input. And all of that input, including the recommendations and the concerns of FCM, will inform the discussion that's about to take place between our finance ministers.
But their ask is straightforward. Give us 33% of the money. But you're not saying yes. You're not saying no.
Well, frankly, it's not my place to say yes or no. But I think that their concerns are going to be on the table and part of the discussion that has to take place between our finance minister, his provincial territorial counterparts. You know, we asked for their input. They've been good enough to provide that to us, and I think it's very important to have that. in the discussions that are about to take place.
All right. You've talked about your government, and you have talked about what the excise tax would be, right? So it's on top of the GST. It's being proposed at, I've got it already, $1 a gram or 10% of the price per gram for all cannabis products sold. Okay. If the cities want in, if the cities want to share, do you think there needs to be some discussion around, okay, if we now have to distribute more of the revenues to other partners, should the excise tax be higher?
Well, let's also keep in mind, we want to make sure that revenue goes towards cost centers and also is invested in those things which help us address the social and health harms and concerns around cannabis. And so we also recognize one big part of the government's agenda is to displace the illicit market. And in order to displace that market, we have to make sure that the price is competitive with that illicit market. And so we've done a fair bit of research in coming to the determination of that dollar. We believe it's a very responsible and advised number based on the evidence that we've gathered that that's the right number to maintain a competitive market. And that's the discussion that's also taking place.
So no matter how the pot of excise tax revenue gets split, you don't think you're really in a position to boost taxes
I have to tell you,
to feed more partners?
I have to tell you, I think the most important focus is on reducing social and health harms. We want to do a better job of keeping this out of the hands of the kids, and we want to keep the profits out of the hands of organized crime. Maintaining that balance, price and tax levers are a really important consideration in achieving both of those public purpose aims. We didn't get into this for revenue. We know that there are revenue implications. That revenue should be committed towards addressing costs that anybody incurs as a result of these new regulations, but also investing in treatment, rehabilitation, prevention, research. Those are the types of things that can produce additional public benefit, and that's what we're committed to.
First Nations leaders are saying they too they want to set they want a say in how this is all going to unfold. They want to set the rules to govern the sale and distribution of marijuana in their communities once it's legalized, and to set their own laws for its use on their reserves. So let's say they're in a province where the age is 18, maybe they think it should be higher, and they want the ability to do that. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I believe, we brought forward Bill C-45 because we wanted to keep this drug out of the hands of kids, all kids, including kids in Indigenous communities. We did this because we want to displace organized crime and get them out of this market because of the negative impact they have in communities, all communities, including Indigenous communities. We recognize and respect the importance of nation-to-nation discussions with Indigenous communities. We know there's a great diversity of opinion there, but we have a shared goal of protecting our kids, protecting our communities, and protecting the health of our citizens in every part of Canada. And so that will also inform that nation-to-nation discussion that is also taking place on this issue, and we're listening. We're trying to respond appropriately. I think I think what we heard from the Indigenous leaders just this past week underlines its complexity and the importance of those discussions.
Right. So, it's a multi-jurisdictional conversation, as you've said. So, what they're saying is, we're not going to be bound by the laws set by others, by the rules set by a province. We want to make our own laws for how this is going to be sold, distributed. Some are suggesting, some say now they have marijuana dispensaries on their territories, and they say, they're illegal, and they're saying they're not closing them. And they're saying we don't feel we have to close them. It's not, if we want them, we'll keep them.
There are a number of things that we have to discuss between us in that nation-to-nation discussion. But I'm encouraged by the fact that there is a consensus that the current system is unacceptable, is not working. We can do better. We have to do better in protecting all of our kids and in displacing organized crime. The risk to kids in Indigenous communities is just as great as it is in every other part of Canada. The impact of criminal enterprise and organized crime in Indigenous communities is just as significant and negative as it is in the rest of Canada. The need to protect people's health is just as strong there. And so we have common ground. And so, there's clearly a lot of work yet to be done in those discussions, but we begin, I think, in a very strong place in that consensus.
But can you say whether, in the discussions you've had, whether it's been contemplated some sort of carve-out for First Nations communities outside of provincial rules and laws and federal demands that will allow them to say, we may be on side with what the government has in mind in principle, but we'll decide how it gets applied in our
Well, let me just give you an example. There are a number of self-governing Indigenous communities in this country that have declared themselves dry. They don't permit the sale of alcohol. And that's done through various provisions in the Indian Act and in provincial regulation that acknowledges the authority of those self-governing communities to make that determination. And so that's an important discussion that's also taking place in the provinces and territories as they develop their own regulatory system for the distribution of cannabis. It'll be informed by their experience with other intoxicating substances like alcohol, and I think that's a really important discussion that needs to take place. And certainly the federal government's at the table, but along with our provincial and territorial partners and those Indigenous nations that have an important say in this. And so those discussions are taking place and will continue.
All right, Bill Blair, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's talk about a big case at the Supreme Court of Canada and possible ramifications from that case. The way marijuana can be sold in Canada may be affected by a case heard over the past 2 days by the Supreme Court of Canada. We reported at length last night on the so-called Free the Beer case, dealing with the limits on alcohol Canadians can transport between provinces. That hearing concluded today, and we'll wait for a decision from the High Court. It was all carried live, of course, here on CPAC.ca. One of the interveners in the case is Cannabis Cultures, which describes itself as a cannabis media and advocacy company. It operates cannabis lounges and cannabis dispensaries, or allows others to run cannabis culture franchises, even though they are illegal. One in Ottawa, in fact, was raided by police again today with an eviction notice from the building landlords. Now, Jodie Emery is the co-owner of Cannabis Cultures and has been following the border beer case at the Supreme Court because of all those possible implications I talked about. She is with me now here in our studios. Good to see you again. Thanks for being here. Why did you feel it was important to intervene in a case about provincial control and trading barriers about alcohol and how it's moved between provinces and what effect that could have, I guess, on marijuana?
Well, my husband, Mark Emery, was asked by the Canadian Constitution Foundation to help them out in this case. And when we asked our lawyers last summer, or this summer, if we had any standing, they thought we didn't, until the Ontario government announced that they were going to have an Ontario government monopoly on the sale and retail sale of cannabis. So when that was announced, our lawyers felt we had an argument that if the Comeau case determines that monopolies and restrictions on alcohol sales between provinces is unconstitutional, we can argue the same for cannabis, that the provinces and territories shouldn't be allowed to restrict the movement of cannabis goods between our provinces and territories.
Okay, why not?
Well, we think free trade within our country is very important, and right now you can get coffee or food or products of any kind from within Canada. There aren't any restrictions on that, but alcohol sticks out as this one product that the government is so intent on containing and controlling and profiting from. And we feel very concerned that with the new legalization model of cannabis coming out, that these restrictions on trade of cannabis will prevent the growth of the industry and prevent all of the opportunities that legalization is supposed to offer, and it won't impact the black market that already exists.
Okay. Some on the other side might argue, look, if the provinces don't set up a regulatory framework for who gets to sell this, who gets to distribute it, how it's distributed, then you have issues about controlling quality of the product, the safety of the product, the black market and organized crime, all the things you've talked about. If you can't restrict how it's sold and distributed, how do you ensure that you meet the standards that I've just mentioned? Product safety, product quality?
Most people who go into business of any kind go into it wanting to serve customers, not hurt them, to do something worthwhile and to help grow jobs, tax revenue. So businesses usually operate with integrity, especially if they're small businesses. And all across this country we have small business owners, entrepreneurs, young professionals like myself and many others who are looking to find an opportunity through cannabis retail sales to be able to advance ourselves. And when the government restricts that, they're using the criminal law to punish those who dare to try and do something different. So this sort of restriction violates our liberty, it violates our freedom, and when you're looking at what cannabis offers as opportunities, we're going to be denied all of those opportunities, and governments are looking to control this alcohol industry and cannabis as if they're vices, and we know alcohol is, but cannabis is not.
Right. So would you make the case that, for instance, the province of Quebec allows, and other provinces allow beer sales in corner stores? So those are private entrepreneurs selling a regulated product, you'd make the same argument, I guess, for cannabis. That why does it have to be a government agency that's doing the selling?
Well, one of the arguments made today by another intervener was saying that within provinces, you can have rules and restrictions on where it can be sold and who can buy it, because that impacts those people within those boundaries, within that province. But once you start restricting the trade and the purchase of goods from other provinces, that becomes a national issue. It starts to impede on our national economy, and we're supposed to have one shared economy with no restrictions or borders. So there are some very interesting arguments put forward, and I have to admit I'm not a legal expert. That's why our fantastic lawyers did all of the work on this. But for me, it's about free trade and about our right to be able to sell BC bud to Ontario residents. And what's very interesting is that the very same companies that sell medical marijuana today can sell it to anyone in Canada, no matter where it's grown. But that very same product, the very same pot, will not be allowed to be sold recreationally. And that sort of difference doesn't make any sense. There's no sort of reason for it. So this case is very complicated for a lot of reasons.
Right. So what would be the big win for you? Ultimately, if the Supreme Court decides, you know, there's a problem, we think the restrictions on interprovincial trade in alcohol, because that's what this case is, but lots flows from it. If they say that should no longer be allowed in this country, what happens next, do you think?
For me, I've been a legalization advocate my entire adult life, and I thought it meant that we would experience more freedom from criminalization. But as the federal government's C-45 legislation sets out, they control production, provinces control retail, wholesale distribution. But that's not right and not fair. And what they use to enforce that are criminal laws and penalties and all sorts of harm and tough enforcement that's totally unjustified and unnecessary. So as Ontario and other provinces started announcing their marijuana models, you saw a lot of law enforcement emphasis. You saw a lot of talk, like 2 years in jail for a landlord who leases to a dispensary that's not authorized. That's an insane response to what should just be a simple problem. We have a lot of entrepreneurs and business people who want to be legal. We just want to be able to open up like a coffee shop or a bar or a restaurant, and we're deprived of that ability through harsh penalties. So that's why I'm excited to challenge the provincial monopolies. And if the Supreme Court sides with Comeau, it would say to the provinces and territories, you need to do something about these models you're proposing, but more importantly, it might tell the federal government, you have to do something about C-45 because you cannot order the provinces and territories to restrict and have their own models.
So would you take, if the court rules the way you want the court to rule, would you be first in line to take the Ontario government to court if they don't change that model?
Oh, it would probably be a good place to do it. Ontario is the power center and the economic engine of this country. I mean, there's a lot at stake here, and it's really disturbing to see our governments denying our citizens the right to create jobs and tax revenue through a free market model and using our tax dollars to create their own bureaucracy, which they admit won't make money, and to use criminal law to punish those who dare try and participate.
But that argument that the provinces make about this is how we fund health care, this is how we fund different services, and we need the control to be able to control the product so we know exactly how much revenue we're getting, we can count on it, we can collect it, all those things.
I see their argument, but it makes me very sad to know that governments are relying on alcohol as the third largest income source for provincial government revenue. That's insane. That means these governments have to keep promoting and pushing a dangerous, deadly drug that they admit costs hundreds of millions of dollars in health care and other costs to society and individuals. So they admit this dangerous, deadly, terrible drug is so important to them as a financial source, even though it creates all these health care harms. I think it's a terrible thing for them to be in that position. They should be saying, let's let alcohol move freely so craft beer and wine can move about. We can have industries working as they are, but let cannabis in as a safer choice, as an alternative. It will create hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue. We can save hundreds of millions in law enforcement. Look at Colorado and elsewhere where they build schools and fund health care with marijuana money. But here in Canada, with all of these restrictions and monopolies and deprivations of people's ability to engage, they're going to cost us all not just so much in tax dollars, but also in our liberty and our freedom of choice.
All right, Jodie, Emery, thanks for that perspective. Good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.